Okay. Well, people continue to log on, but we'll get started here. So tonight is the AIPG Texas Section monthly webinar. The title of the webinar is Dollars for Water, Quantifying Hydroeconomic Constraints to Groundwater Recoverability. Our presenter is Dr. Justin Thompson's I'm reading his bio. Dr. Justin Thompson's key expertise is water resource management and planning, a nexus of hydrology, policy, and economics. He currently serves as a postdoctoral fellow at the Bureau of Economic Geology at the University of Texas at Austin. So we have Dr. Thompson on here. And what we'll do is, if you have any questions, you can put it in the chat. And then at the end, we can, if you want to raise your hand, we can unmute you to actually ask a question, or we can read the questions, and Dr. Thompson can answer them at that time. So we will get started, and thank you for attending this evening.
All right. Well, yes, thank you for that kind introduction. I really appreciate being here tonight. I'm happy to do so. And I appreciate everyone in the audience giving up part of their evening to hear me talk. So I'm here today, and I'm going to talk to you, as was mentioned, about quantifying the hydroeconomic constraints to groundwater recoverability. So with that, let's go ahead and just jump right in and get started. If I can advance my slide. There we go. It always takes a moment to start. Okay. So I want to start tonight's talk speaking a little bit about the motivation for this study, because I hope you'll agree that it's really kind of important, right? Because this work is founded in some sort of real world questions. So let's talk about our motivation here. And really what we're talking about is this question: is Texas exhausting its groundwater resources? Well, let's start with big picture here, right? What we're looking at is the sort of headline graphic from the latest 2022 State Water Plan. And in this purple line, we've got our projected demand over the 50-year 2020 to 2070 planning period. And then we've got this blue dash line showing our existing supply projections over that same period. And what you can see just immediately is that under drought of record conditions, right, existing supply lags behind demand, right? So what that really means is that if a drought of record were to strike at any point during this planning period, we would expect water supply deficits. Why is my clicker not working? There we go. By 2070, those deficits would be about 7 million acre feet. And those deficits would have economic ramifications. And if a drought of record were to happen in 2020, it would be about $110 billion of lost economic output, which climbs to $153 billion of lost economic output by 2070. And that's for 1 year of drought of record conditions. If it's a multi-year drought, those costs climb. So good news, there are plans to address this. Bad news, they don't get us to 100%. More bad news, many of the strategies, as they're known in the water plan, are very costly, and the viability of some of them is debatable. So let's take a little bit of a closer look at this existing supply. First, let's look at surface water. Here we see, there's really not that much interesting going on. Availability and existing supply, these two terms we'll talk about more in a little bit. Not a lot of change, a 3%, 2% decline respectively, and that's mostly due to sedimentation of our reservoirs. So, okay, surface water, fairly constant. But what about groundwater? Well, different story, right? So our groundwater availability and existing supply is projected to decline by 25% and 32% respectively over the planning period. So that would, maybe seem to answer the question, oh my, we are exhausting our groundwater resources. Maybe, maybe not. We'll get into that. This 32% decline in existing supply is equivalent to about 3 million acre feet, which is about 42% of those 2070 deficits that I just told you about. So, okay, well, let's dig a little further into this. Are we really exhausting our groundwater supply? Well, to answer that question, I've got to give you a super short crash course, if you will, in groundwater management in Texas, or what I like to call the alphabet soup. So we start with our groundwater conservation districts, or GCDs. Those are the gray shaded areas you see in the map to your right here. GCDs are organized into groundwater management areas, or GMAs, which are the numbered areas you see in the map to the right here. And those management areas generally correspond to the footprints of our major aquifers, which you see in the colors in the map here. So GCDs within a GMA work collaboratively to adopt what are known as desired future conditions, or DFCs. Desired future conditions are a statement of what we want our aquifer to look like over a time period, over a planning horizon. They take a number of forms throughout the state, but they're most commonly expressed as a change in depth to water, right? So for example, at this local GCD, we want to see our aquifer water levels, the depth of those water levels increase by 25 feet over 50 years, for example. Okay, so GCDs within a GMA adopt DFCs, and they send those to the Texas Water Development Board, who integrates them with their groundwater availability models, or GAMs, to produce what is known as modeled available groundwater, or a MAG. The modeled available groundwater is basically an estimate of how much water you could produce within that district, right, or management area, depending on what you're looking at, in order to meet that desired future condition. Okay, I know, right? I mean, alphabet soup, right? Okay, well, if you take nothing else from this little crash course on groundwater management, just recall that our groundwater conservation districts are our primary regulatory entities. If you want to drill a new groundwater well and you need a permit, this is who you go to. And they manage the aquifer within their jurisdiction according to these desired future conditions, which are most frequently a change in water levels over time. It's really all you need to remember. Okay, so with that crash course out of the way, let's return to the question at hand. How much water do we have in Texas? Well, in some respects, it's quite a lot, right? So what I've got here on the left is the total storage estimate of the volume of water stored by our major aquifers. And you can see here that this red aquifer, right, the Carrizo-Wilcox, which extends sort of northeast to southwest through the sort of center-ish of the state, it stores about 5.2 billion acre feet of water. That's billion with a B as a sort of a frame of reference. That's a little over half of the storage volume of Lake Superior. And it's followed closely by the sort of, aptly named Gulf Coast aquifer appearing here along the Gulf Coast in yellow, which stores a little over 4 billion acre feet of water. Okay, so, fair amount of water here in storage in the state. So let's come back to this question of availability and supply. Well, here again, sort of lifted from the state water plan is the sort of leading sources of groundwater in terms of availability and existing supply. They're grouped a little bit oddly, right, just in terms of how they were modeled, but that's okay. We can still see right there, there's the Carrizo-Wilcox. So Carrizo-Wilcox, that 5.2 billion acre feet of water stored, availability is 1.2 million. And existing supply is a little more than half of that at 672,000, right, acre feet. So at this point, you might be scratching your head a little and saying, "Wait a minute. I'm confused, Justin. You just told me deficits 7 million acre feet, and then you told me the Carrizo stores 5.2 billion acre feet, but then you told me availability is 1.2 million acre feet. What is going on here? Help me square these numbers." Okay, well, fair enough. You would be right to be a little bit confused. What we got to do is we got to sort out some nomenclature here. And I think the best way to do that is to think of these terms as sort of a series of subsets, sort of concentric circles, right? So we start with total storage, right? So that's how much water is sitting underground in the aquifer. For the Carrizo, that's that 5.2 billion acre feet. And then there's some subset of total storage. That's going to be the amount that could be potentially feasible to recover, right? Recoverable volume. And that's going to be less than total storage for many reasons, but if nothing else, because it's almost physically impossible to completely drain an aquifer. Okay, so we got storage, then something less than that's recoverable. And then something less than that, in most cases, is what's available. And here's the rub, here's the tricky part. What the state water plan considers as available groundwater is the amount of water that can be produced under those management plans, under those desired future conditions. So when you hear available groundwater in state and regional water planning, it's not, as you might think, right, what could be available, what could be recoverable. It's what's available under those management plans. Okay, so that's kind of this disconnect between, certainly between storage and availability. And then finally, we've got supply. Supply is pretty easy to understand. It's a subset of availability. It's just the amount of the available water that's connected to existing users via existing infrastructure. Okay, so now that we've got that settled a little bit, let's explore this availability term and this management plans and the limitations thereof. What goes into that? Well, our groundwater conservation districts are required by Texas law, specifically Chapter 36 of Texas Water Code, Section 108D, to consider a number of sort of factors when they're thinking about and adopting desired future conditions. One of those factors is, in fact, recoverability. For that, they have a statutorily defined term known as total estimated recoverable storage, or TERS for short, if you will. And so you might think, oh, okay, well, it's right there in the name, TERS, right? That tells us, okay, how much is recoverable, that next circle out in our sort of concentric circles of volumes. Well, yeah, kind of, sort of. TERS, for example, in the Carrizo-Wilcox would in fact estimate that there are potentially billions of acre feet of water that could be available. And that's led some people to kind of question, well, wait a minute, is groundwater availability under our current planning processes just the tip of the iceberg for what could be recoverable? Maybe, maybe not. The trouble is that TERS is a very limited term, right? So TERS is simply, it's two numbers, it's two volumes, and they're arbitrary benchmarks on total storage. It's just 25% and 75% of total storage. So TERS takes absolutely no account of things like pumping dynamics or economics, none of that, right? It's very arbitrary, and in that sense, it's very limited. So then how could you maybe define a recoverable yield? What would that mean? Well, I think the problem with TERS personally is that it tries to be a single answer when in reality, recoverability and feasibility, right? These are subjective. I mean, what are your physical limitations? What are your economic limitations? That's going to be very subjective. So there can't really be a single answer. And then with any potential yield scenario, there's going to be, yield X results in impacts Y, right? So, what are you potentially considering? So speaking of impacts, there's another DFC consideration, and that is the socioeconomic impacts reasonably expected to occur under the DFC. Okay, another thing you might think, yeah, it's probably good to think about when we set these management targets. Well, unfortunately, according to the sort of latest 2021 DFC explanatory reports, where our groundwater districts discuss how they considered these various factors, they pretty much unanimously agreed that, well, we could only do so much with respect to socioeconomic impacts because there's just no quantitative method available to kind of get our arms around this. So we handle it qualitatively, or we, really only thought about the impact of not having the water. So it's sort of a limited approach, right? Well, that leaves me personally, and maybe you too, with some research questions. And these are questions that we're going to explore in the remainder of this talk. So number one, well, how could recoverability be better quantified, right? I mean, could we maybe come up with some method, some way to try to do something a little bit more rigorous than the 25%, 75% arbitrary benchmarks of TERS? Number two, how do aquifer storage conditions drive recoverability, if at all, right? I mean, are there factors about the aquifers themselves that might sort of limit or expand recoverability? Let's find out. And then number three, well, kind of addressing that socioeconomic question, all right, how might changes in depth to water, as for example, under desired future conditions, impact our users? Okay, well, these are the questions we're going to explore a little bit further with the talk today. Let's start with our first question. How can we better quantify recoverability? Well, my approach and the approach of my co-authors is to come up with an analytical model that quantifies changes in hydroeconomic well performance with changes in depth to water. Right? Again, most of those DFCs are expressed in some change in depth to water. Okay, so how does hydroeconomic well performance change under those circumstances? Well, to me, when I think about feasibility and recoverability, I think that there's sort of two components to that, right? You've got sort of physical elements, and then you've got economic elements. And that's kind of the approach we've developed here. So for the physical side, what we're interested in is the operational status of our groundwater wells, right? And so here, what we want to understand is that the capacity of a well to meet our pumping demand declines as that water level gets deeper and deeper and deeper. And on a simplistic fundamental level, that's true for any well pumping from any aquifer for any use. So if we understand that as the water levels get deeper and deeper, the capacity to meet demand falls, then the question we ask ourselves is, okay, well, as the water levels get deeper, can the well meet pumping demand without failing? And additionally, if it does fail, can it be remediated? Can we fix it? Can we bring it back into operational status? And then again, putting all this together and understanding that that capacity falls, we can imagine that there's some water level where this well, if we go any deeper, right, then the well will fail to operate, right? We just can't go any further, or we're dry, right, or our pump burns up, something like that. Okay, so that's kind of the physical side, the operational side, right? Well, what about the economic side? Well, here, what we want to understand is that fundamentally, as the water levels get deeper and deeper and deeper, our costs of running that well increase. Again, that's true for any well, any aquifer serving any use. So here, the question we ask ourselves is, so how do our pumping costs, our operating costs, right, change as these water levels change? And additionally, perhaps, are they affordable? Right? Again, if the well does fail and it needs to be remediated, what are those remediation costs, right? That's not free, right? How does that change affordability in our operating costs? And so here again, kind of putting all this together, we can imagine that there may or may not be some water level where our costs are going to increase to such a point that they're equivalent to what we're willing to pay for that water. So basically, if we go any lower, then we're losing money, right? Or it's unaffordable for us to operate this well. So there again, we can imagine some threshold, right? So just to reiterate, so there's some threshold where we can't go any lower or the well fails, and there's some water level threshold where it becomes unaffordable. We're going to use this term water level threshold a few times throughout the talk. Okay, well, this is an AIPG talk, so let's dig a little bit further into the methods. Let's get into some meat and some math here. So, okay, on the operational side, on this sort of physical component side, what are we really talking about? How are we doing this exactly? Well, the key thing that we're doing is we're quantifying and calculating how pumping drawdown behaves, right? So I'll take a moment. Let's try to be clear. So pumping drawdown is separate and distinct from our water levels and any changes in our water levels. And they're related, but separate and distinct. Our water levels will change slowly, regionally, over long periods of time as pumping goes on and on and on. But pumping drawdown, that describes how the water level in the well behaves when you say, kick your well on for a couple hours, pumping 50 gallons a minute, and then kick it back off, right? So the water levels in the well, they're going to sort of bounce back up and down as you turn the pump off and on, never exceeding that regional water level, right? But certainly at many times while the pump is running, some being somewhat well below it, right? Depending on your particular circumstances. And it's really this water level in the well that we need to understand hydroeconomic well performance. It doesn't really matter so much in a lot of ways what the water levels are doing out here. We need to know what's happening in the well to understand, well, is the pump about to burn up? Or how far am I lifting this water? How much is it costing me, right? So this is really a key kind of component of understanding what's going on. And to do that, we can use a couple of ways. You could use, for example, specific capacity. I and my co-authors have done this in a previous paper, and some of folks out of California who are also kind of working, some of the only other people working in this sphere with this particular question in mind, have used this approach. Specific capacity is useful. It's pretty easy to understand. It's frequently reported in units like gallons per minute per foot of drawdown. So if you know kind of what your pumping rate's going to be, you can estimate what your drawdown would be. So it's easy to use, but it's got some limitations, right? Notably, specific capacity is developed from a pumping test of a specific aquifer, a specific well configuration pumping from a specific aquifer storage conditions. If any of that changes, then specific, for whatever reason, then specific capacity is not going to be able to do a very good job of telling you what drawdown is going to look like in that well, among other limitations. So in our study, what we do is we kind of take it a step further. We use more quote unquote advanced, all right, analytical solutions to estimate drawdown. We start there with the TICE solution, which again, is pretty popular. It's also not terribly hard to calculate. I've got it written out here. Why do I do that? Well, because I want to highlight these T terms, right? Why T? Because T stands for transmissivity. And this is important because in some settings where we're talking about these water levels going lower and lower and lower under management plans, this T term actually declines, right? The ability of the aquifer to transmit water to the well is reduced. And in that case, what happens is that pumping drawdown, where everything else is equivalent, only this water level is changing, our pumping drawdown increases as that transmissivity declines. And it increases non-linearly. So this is an important kind of impact that we really want to capture if we're thinking about what are the impacts to our wells under these declining water levels. So TICE is good. It gets us part of the way there, but it also has limitations. Notably, it assumes that the entire saturated thickness of our aquifer is screened by our well, right? So the entire saturated thickness of the aquifer is transmitting water to our well. And that might be appropriate, that might be true, but in a lot of cases, it's really not, right? For one reason or another, notably for cost reasons, many of our wells only partially penetrate our aquifer. And when that happens, we actually have additional pumping drawdown impacts. So for that, what we use is the Hantu solution on drawdown. And once again, I've got the whole equation written out here. Why? Because I want to draw attention to some of these highlighted terms. There's our friend Mr. T again, but then we've also got A, B, C, and D. Why do I have those highlighted? Well, D, they're all sort of almost all a function of the well infrastructure. D certainly is, but B, A, and C, these are all also functions of that water level. So as that water level is changing, right, these A, B, C terms are also going to change, and they will also change in different ways, right? Depending on the well screen and aquifer interface. So we really want to capture that relationship. And importantly, right, partial penetration drawdown effects, again, depending on the parameters that you're looking at, partial penetration drawdown effects can be several times more drawdown than you might expect under just TICE. So we employed the Hantu solution as well, sort of combination approach. Okay, so now that we've kind of got this method to understand how the water levels in the well are physically behaving, how the well and the aquifer are responding to pumping, what about that economic side again? Okay, well for that, again, we're going to bring in that pumping drawdown quantification to help us with our cost components. Right, so we break our cost components into three pieces. We look at lifting energy, so just the energy cost of lifting water to land surface at the given pumping rate. We also look at pump equipment, right? So what is the horsepower requirement of this pump, right, to lift that water that distance at that pumping rate? And as you might be able to imagine, and you see here in the equation, both of those cost components are a direct function of both that changing depth to water, right? Those water levels that are getting deeper, and that drawdown S that we're calculating, right, for this well infrastructure and these uses. And then finally, of course, we've got drilling and installation, which at least initially isn't really a function of the water level in the drawdown. But we want to, of course, include that. It's an important part of our groundwater operating costs. I also mentioned remediation. So our analytical approach tells us not only when wells are at risk of operationally failing, but it also tells us what remediation solutions are potentially applicable and how much they might cost. So we look at 4 remediation solutions. We start with looking at simply setting deeper pumps. If we could imagine this pump was up here somewhere and it was in danger of sort of running dry and burning up, well then just, hey, drop the depth of the pump within the existing well infrastructure. Job done. But if that's not good enough, then we have other impacts as well, right? So we might need to install more powerful pumps, right? If we need to meet that pumping rate and the power required to lift water from greater and greater distances increasing. And then if the well fails, we might need to deepen it, right? We might need to drop this whole thing further down into the aquifer if it's partially penetrating, for example. Or we might even need to just drill an entirely new well. Maybe we're in a deep water-bearing formation here, and it's at risk of failing, but there are actually other formations overlying that could supply the water. Well, that's an option too. Okay, so that altogether kind of wraps up our addressing question 1. How could we potentially do a better job of trying to quantify hydroeconomic well performance and thereby groundwater recoverability? Now, that's our pass at it anyhow. So now we want to move on to addressing our second and third research question. And for that, what we do is we sort of develop and test these methods using a case study. And specifically, we do a case study of the Carrizo-Wilcox Aquifer, that big red one, right? 5.2 billion acre feet stored. And we look at the Carrizo-Wilcox Aquifer specifically within the Post Oak Savannah Groundwater Conservation District. So let's learn a little bit more about that, familiarize briefly. So why Post Oak Savannah Groundwater Conservation District? Well, a number of reasons. I think first and foremost is that it presents varied storage conditions of the Carrizo-Wilcox within the district, right? And that's obviously kind of important if one of our research questions is, how do storage conditions drive recoverability? So here you've got the district in yellow. It's right here in central Texas, right? Just a little east of where I'm at now in Austin. And then we've gotten this blue shading. That's kind of courtesy of the Texas Water Development Board's aquifer geometry model showing where the aquifer lies in this district. And then if you look at this A to A prime transect, here and here, what you see is that here sort of toward the northwest of the aquifer, that's kind of where it outcrops, and the groundwater is stored at more sort of shallow, unconfined, what you might call water table conditions. And then as you progress southeast through the district, because the aquifer is down dip, the groundwater stored is increasingly deep and confined, right? It's under pressurized conditions, right? So we've got a nice sort of varied storage conditions to test here, all within one district. That's great for our second research question. Other reasons why we chose Post Oak Savannah GCD. Well, one, it's the home to the pumping field, the well field that serves the Vista Ridge project, which you may or may not have heard about. Vista Ridge, the well field is right about there, roundabout, and it supplies water to the city of San Antonio via pipeline over 100 miles away. Other reasons, the latest 2021 desired future conditions, right? The management plan for how this we're expecting this aquifer to change over time, over the planning horizon, anticipates a 50 to 109% increase in depth to water, right? There's a range there because the change in depth to water is formation specific for each of the 4 formations of the Carrizo-Wilcox, right? So for example, the Simsboro Formation, one of the more productive formations of the aquifer in this area, at the initial sort of 2010 calibrated depth to water, on average throughout the district was about 256 feet down in depth. At the end of 2069, beginning 2070, so at the end of this DFC planning period, the average water level in the district is going to increase to 534 feet. So it's going to more than double in depth on average in the district. So if you're interested in testing, okay, well, what are the impacts of changes in depth to water? Okay, a significant change in depth to water is probably a good place to look. And then finally, the district not too long ago implemented a policy intervention known as the Groundwater Well Assistance Program, or colloquially the GWAP. And what the GWAP does is it provides financial assistance to well owners who experience an operational failure of some sort or another under these desired future conditions, right? So that's kind of interesting, right? We can kind of use our results and kind of compare and contrast and draw some interesting conclusions. Okay, so enough table setting. Let's look at some actual results. Let's start with our second research question. How do storage conditions drive recoverability? And I'll do my quick sort of caveat here. I've got my big red stamp in the corner there, preliminary demonstration only. I've got that there because I just want to be clear that we're still developing these tools and these models, right? We're still in a multi-phase alpha at this point. There'll be more testing and a beta version, and then ultimately hopefully a 1.0 version. And as we make small improvements and tweaks to the model, the results change slightly. So all I really want to say is anything you see here in the next few slides on results, just don't take it as carved in stone. It should be a good example, but nothing too specific. Okay, disclaimer aside. So how do storage conditions drive recoverability? Well, for that, what we did was we imagined that we've got a model optimized well infrastructure, right? So we're saying, let's take the well infrastructure part of the equation out as best we can. Let's imagine that we've designed wells that are optimized to maximize those thresholds from which they can pump, operational and affordability. And then, okay, let's say we are imagining that one of these model optimized wells is pumping from each one of these 1 square mile grid cells throughout the district. If we drained that 1 square mile grid cell from what it is at 2010 to that threshold, how much water would be produced? That's what you see here, okay? And in this case, this is if we drained each one of these grid cells to the operational threshold, where, okay, how low can you go? If we go any deeper, the well operationally fails. It's already model optimized. It couldn't be remediated. So this is truly as low as we could go. And I wouldn't use this as like a planning tool, right? But for addressing our research question, it's actually a great approach, right? It tells us how things vary in each one of these grid cells. So what we see here is quite a lot of variability throughout the district. For one thing, we've got this sort of band of white cells. These white cells indicate that under the parameters for this model run, where we were looking at kind of a representative agricultural use, say pumping 70 gallons per minute, willingness to pay of $100 per acre foot, and so on. Under those parameters, these white cells, it's not feasible to produce here. And then as you proceed to sort of cooler to hotter colors, you get smaller to higher yields, right? All the way up to over 56,000 acre feet in 1 square mile down here. We'll come back to what are the drivers here and what does that mean. But first, let's just do a quick compare and contrast. That's how much water is produced in each one of these grid cells if we drain from 2010 to the operational threshold. How low can you go, right? What does it look like if we drain from 2010 to the affordability threshold? How low can you go? Very different story, right? So these are to the same scale. And we see the same band of white cells here, right, where it's just not operationally, physically feasible to produce. And then we've got just this narrow band of warmer colors where we've got some more moderate yields, and then just a whole bunch of very cool color, very low yield. Right, so I'll take a quick moment and explain. Right, remember, we're imagining how much water is produced in this cell if we drain from 2010 to this threshold. Well, what's going on here in this hot colors, right, is the water level for that affordability threshold is occurring somewhere within the saturated thickness of the aquifer. So the water being produced there is from actually draining the pore space of the aquifer itself. Whereas down here, where it's really light, cool green, what's happening is that affordability, how low can you go, is occurring somewhere in the pressure head of the aquifer. So the water being produced is actually being produced by the expansion of the aquifer and the water itself. And the difference between those two mechanics is orders of magnitude, right? So the water being produced down here for an equivalent change in water levels is much, much smaller than what's being produced here, right, where the water levels change is occurring within the saturated thickness, just to kind of explain. Now, so let's look at these drivers. What's going on there? Okay, So operational yields, that's the figure you just saw, which again, just by reference, I wouldn't use it that way, but for reference is about 73% of total storage. What's driving that? Well, I kind of already told you, right? You can see here just immediately visually that the saturated thickness of the aquifer itself is what's driving those operational yields, right? This is saturated thickness. These are the yields. You could almost lie to me and tell me that's the same graphic. It's not. It's really not. But boy, it sure looks like it is. And that's just a testament to how closely these factors are related. And again, that goes back to what I just explained, right? If you're draining the aquifer and figuring out how much you could be produced by doing that, water produced by draining the saturated thickness of it is really key, right? Because of those storage coefficients. And you just kind of see that numerically here, right? In these trend lines showing that same close relationship. Okay, well, what about the affordability side of things? Well, that's a little bit more complicated. It's a little bit trickier to understand. So let's just kind of try. Okay, so first and foremost, right, you have to understand that, again, because the aquifer gets deeper and deeper and deeper as you proceed to the southeast, it gets more and more expensive to drill a well down into that formation. So there's a there's a close relationship between the depth of the bottom of the aquifer, right, and the depth of that affordability threshold. That's what you see here, right? But then going back to what I was just talking about how much water is produced, and it depends on where the change in water level falls. That's what you're seeing here. So the hot colors here you see are falling right along this band here, where I've overlain some shading showing you where the aquifer is in confined conditions. So this is really just showing you that this affordability threshold is falling somewhere in this hot colors, somewhere again within that saturated thickness. So you're getting that pore space drainage production, hence those much bigger numbers. Okay. So that's research question number 2, right? What drives or what kind of aquifer storage parameters might drive recoverability all by themselves? What about that last research question, right? How might these changes in depth to water under, say, for example, desired future conditions impact users? Well, for that, we're going to come a little bit out of the clouds here from, imaginary, hypothetical, model optimized wells, and we're going to look at actually existing well infrastructure today, right? So here we collected data that described these aquifers and use parameters, wells and use parameters for 503 wells. The overwhelming majority of those wells were domestic wells, right? 445. Then we got a decent collection of some livestock wells and then just kind of a few irrigation wells. So we run these existing well infrastructures through our analytical model. And what did it tell us? Well, first of all, it told us that of those 503 wells, about 173 of them did experience an operational failure. And you see, okay, 158 of those were domestic wells. That's not surprising that domestic would dominate because that dominates our sample set. But you already see some sort of outsized impacts by use type, right? 9 of our 14 agricultural wells failed, right? That's a much higher percentage than 158 of 45. So then we identified where the wells failed. Then a model went ahead and said, okay, well, fortunately, in this circumstance, all 173 of these operational failures were able to be remediated. And in terms of remediation, 142 of them, the vast majority, were remediated simply by dropping the depth of the pump within that existing well infrastructure. And only 31 required well deepening, right? Drilling that well a little deeper into the current formation. No remediation was needed where a well was drilled into a deeper formation, and no remediation was required to drill into an overlying formation. Okay. So now what we do is we say, okay, we know the remediation, we know the failures, now let's get to costs. And what we find is for this 60-year 2010 to 2070 planning period, all of our uses all together, operating all of those wells and remediating them as needed cost about $13 million. The vast majority of those costs for everybody were drilling costs. Equipment was a very small sliver, and then lifting energy, right? A decent chunk. We see some interesting kind of distributions here based on our use types. And here again, I didn't put it all here, but it's the same convention, right? The lightest color is drilling, right? Then the next color is equipment, and then the darkest is lifting energy. Our domestic users, right, 79% of total costs, livestock 10. What's interesting here is just quickly that our irrigation uses composed 11% of all of these costs. They're nowhere near 11% of wells tested. So we're seeing some sort of interesting, distribution of costs among use types. Okay, so we've got the costs at 2010. Now what we want to do here, we're saying, look, we're holding that water level at 2010 constant. There's no change in that water level, that 2010 water level. It's just constant. And then we pump from 2010 to 2070. That's what these costs show. But to understand what the economic impact of the desired future condition is, what we do is we rerun all of these wells through the same analytical model, but instead of holding that 2010 water level constant, we have it change linearly, right, according to the desired future condition. Then we take the difference between those costs right under that increasing depth of water level and this constant 2010 water level, and that's the economic impact of this, the direct economic impact of these desired future conditions. And for that, what we see is a very different picture, right? So first of all, we find that just the added costs of the desired future condition is about $1.4 million for everybody. What I think is probably more interesting is actually the distribution of those added costs. So here we've got sort of the same color convention. We've got drilling in the lightest, pump equipment, right? And then lifting energy. Now we have this other this other cost type for service. That's for things like pulling those pumps and dropping them deeper, right? And what's fascinating here to me is that, wow, the distribution of costs, of the added costs, is just night and day different from the costs at the 2010 water level. I'll flip back and forth and you can kind of just watch. Here, drilling costs, that was the elephant in the room. Here, it's a tiny piece of the impact of these costs. And for all use cases, for all use types, the majority impact was actually lifting energy costs, right? With our domestic users being the smallest percentage at 38% of their total cost impacts of this DFC being lifting costs. Okay, wow, fascinating. Well, on a similar note, right, I mentioned that GWAP, right, that policy intervention that provides financial assistance where your well experiences trouble. Well, that's interesting, right? That's exactly what it does, right? It provides financial assistance to remedy operational failures. It does not cover bigger pumps or lifting energy. It only covers drilling costs and potentially some service costs, I think, my interpretation. So what's interesting there is, so first of all, our irrigators, they don't qualify because of other rules of the program. But if they did, if we took everybody together, right, we see that only 34% of the cost impact of the DFC, right, are those drilling and those service costs are covered under this policy program. The rest of it, right, it's not covered. You're on your own. And it's kind of a similar-ish breakdown, right, with the domestic and livestock uses. 43% of the added costs are covered under GWAP for domestic uses, and only 21% of the added costs are covered under GWAP for our livestock uses. Okay, interesting stuff. Finally, because we're interested in impacts and most of our users were domestic users, we took a look at domestic water affordability. And for that, what we used was the EPA affordability metric of 2.5% of income. Now, it would not be appropriate or indeed even possible to link the income of specific well owners to specific wells. So what we can do, though, is we can bring in income data by census tract, right, specifically median household income, and we can say something about, okay, how many wells within this census tract would be affordable according to this 2.5% income threshold. And then we can go even further and say, okay, well, how many wells within each census tract would be affordable to the income brackets reported by the Census Bureau data? And what we find when we do that is, well, if you look at just the broad brush 2.5% of median household income metric, the vast majority, overwhelming majority, 99% of our domestic wells are affordable. However, if you drill further down and then you start to look at those those income brackets, what we find is that there could potentially, I say potentially, again, we can't link income of specific owners to specific wells, but there could potentially be disproportionate affordability impacts to low income users. So for example, what I mean by that is if you're making at least $50,000 a year, the number of wells that were affordable to you at the initial 2010 depth to water was 442. At 2070 depth to water under the DFC, it's 431, right? So the number of wells affordable to this income bracket has only declined by 2%. Compare and contrast that with the income bracket of $15,000 to $25,000 per year. Well, at the 2010 depth to water, 67 wells were affordable to that income bracket. But at the 2070 depth to water, only 15 remain affordable. So the number of wells affordable to this income bracket has declined by 78%. Also potentially interesting. Okay, so we're running short on time. Talk is coming to a close. I just want to wrap up with some key takeaways, just kind of rehash everything we just talked about really quick. So the situation, our Texas aquifers store billions of acre feet of water, but available groundwater is declining. Available groundwater is a function of our management plans, our desired future conditions. Our groundwater management is, of course, concerned with impacts. However, there is no current method, at least until now, right, to evaluate potentially recoverable yield scenarios, nor is there a method to evaluate the socioeconomic impacts of enacted management plans, those desired future conditions. So we've developed a new approach that analytically quantifies changes in hydroeconomic well performance with changes in depth to water, with those water levels. We use drawdown as a key driver of hydroeconomic well performance. The model provides operational and affordability depth to water thresholds and potentially yields if you want to use it that way. It can tell you least cost remediation options where operational failures do occur, and it can tell you cost impacts, both by type, lifting costs, pump equipment, et cetera. And it can tell you that by planning period, annually, or by volume, like per acre foot. And then additionally, if there are potentially reasons to use that, it can optimize well infrastructure to maximize those depth to water thresholds, which, as I understand it, is relatively novel. I don't believe that that's really been done before. So in our findings, right, with our case study of the Carrizo-Wilcox and Post Oak Savannah, we saw that storage conditions are in fact key recoverability drivers, right? In that particular case, we found that affordability constraints were more limiting to potential yields than operational constraints. We also saw that in terms of socioeconomic impacts of the adopted desired future conditions, that lifting energy and service costs were dominant, right? That drilling costs and pump equipment costs were lesser. And that might potentially, in a certain sense, suggest that the existing policy program, the mitigation program, is somewhat misaligned, at least in terms of the primary impact of these desired future conditions. And then finally, we saw that low-income communities could be disproportionately affected by changes in the affordability of domestic groundwater supplies. Quick acknowledgements. Of course, my co-authors, Michael Young and Charlie Kreitler, and this work would not have been possible without all of the organizations you see on your screen there. The Bureau of Economic Geology, of course, where I'm a postdoctoral fellow right now. The STAR, State of Texas Advanced Resource Recovery Program, the Cynthia and George Mitchell Foundation, the Texas Water Resources Institute, and the BEG Excellence Fund for Water Research and Policy. With that, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you being here. I know we kind of went through a lot, and it was 47 minutes. Seems like a lot, but it goes by quick. I think we've got a Q&A session. I'm happy to answer questions now. I've also got my my email and work phone number there. This is my passion. I would love to talk to you further if you've got additional questions. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, Justin, thank you so much. That was so interesting. So we have a question from Cecilia, and she's asking, is your new approach being applied in other areas in the U.S.?
So that's a great question. Not yet. And I should say clearly, it has not been, quote, applied so far in Texas. It's been applied by me, right? So we're working on the Texas part. We actually are wrapping up what we're calling a pilot program right now, where it's not just me sitting in the ivory tower of academia, playing with all this, but actually working with some groundwater conservation districts to test it. We've also been doing some outreach to other parts of the country. Notably, for example, I've given a very similar talk recently to the University of California system, where these methods and approaches could be used to quantify some of the impacts that would occur under I forget what they call it, measurable objectives, and some water level metrics under the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act in California. So we've definitely done some outreach there, and we're kind of engaging the broader community as we can.
Very good. Let's see. Interesting talk. Does anyone else have any questions, or you would like to be unmuted to ask Justin a question? Because we can do that as well. If you just want to hit the raise hand button so we can identify you, we can do that as well.
I just answered all of your questions instantly, right?
You were very thorough, see?
No, come on. I mean, it's fine. I understand not wanting to ask a question in front of everybody, but gosh, there's so much here. Like, I put these talks together and I think, oh, but what about this part? And what about that part? Oh, I just don't have time to talk about everything.
Better they'll think about it after the fact, and we appreciate you applying or giving us your email on that so they can contact you another time.
Yeah, my pleasure. I mean, I work for the Bureau, and we serve, right? So we're always happy to try to serve the public as best we can. Certainly.
Let's see. Oh, Cecilia has another question. She says, do you think your approach can be applied on a smaller scale in communities?
Well, so that's an interesting question. So what may have gotten lost in the wash a little bit is, so what this model does is it calculates everything for a single well, right? So when I show you these pie charts for this whole district and whatnot, that's a pie chart that's just summing what this model results were for 500 and whatever wells, right? So you can run this model, this approach, for literally one well. And then, in fact, that's exactly what it does. It just can do that 500 times or 1,000 times, right, to kind of draw conclusions regionally. But absolutely, right? So I just to kind of give you a funny anecdote, right? The Post Oak Savannah Groundwater Conservation District, which I have to say they've been really great in this whole process, very cooperative. I've loved working with them, good people. They hold an annual or semi-annual, I forget which, sort of groundwater conference. And I went to one way back in, I don't remember, 2018 or so. And one of my colleagues had given a presentation about the Carrizo Wilcox, and during the Q&A session, this woman stood up and she said, that was very interesting. Thank you for that. But I'm really curious. What do these changes in water levels that are coming with this pipeline project? What do those mean for me and my well? Like, when should I be worried? Should I be worried? And the response from the speaker was, well, I can't really say. I don't know your well. I don't know the specifics. And that experience really stuck with me. And that's exactly what this tool can do, right? It can answer that woman's question, right? If you can parameterize everything, you can tell it what the aquifer looks like and what your well looks like and how you're using the water. It will tell you, here is how your well will respond, right? Here's how your costs will change. Here's where your well will fail or not, or how can you remediate it if it does. So it can give you all that. It's a very long-winded answer, and I'm sorry for that. But it does everything on a well-by-well basis. So it is hyper-local.
Very good. All right. We have other comments, but they're just saying it's very interesting and important work, and they appreciate the information. It was very clear. So yeah, I guess if nobody has any other questions, we will end the webinar, but we will have the recording posted to the AIPG YouTube channel. Will probably be a couple months before that happens, but we'll make sure and get an email out to everyone. And we also post it to make everyone aware on our LinkedIn and Facebook page, on our website. And we also asked Justin if he would provide us his presentation and a PDF. So we'll have that on the website in the members only portion. If anyone is not a member that's attending, just ask us and we can email that to you as well. So Justin, again, thank you so very much for your time and for the presentation. Everybody really enjoyed it. It was very informative, and we really thank you very much for doing that for AIPG in the Texas section.
Yeah, certainly. This is my passion. I always love talking about it. So I do deliberately put my info up there. Like I said, if just reiterate, if folks ruminate on it later and they have thoughtful questions and they want to come back with me later, I'm happy to talk to you. That'd be great.
Awesome. All right. Well, good evening, everyone, and take care.
All right. Thank you all.
Bye-bye.